Every true crime story begins with a life, a person whose presence left an impact on those around them. For James Barrie, that life was built on hard work, quiet resilience, and an unwavering dedication to the people he loved. James wasn't the type of man who lived in the spotlight. Born into a working-class family, his childhood was defined by values of discipline, honesty, and perseverance. His parents, though not wealthy, made sure he understood the importance of responsibility, and that sense of duty carried into adulthood. Those who knew him often described him as reliable, grounded, and someone who would give his last coin to a friend in need. By his mid-30s, James had carved out a modest but stable routine. He worked long hours, often sacrificing his own comfort to make sure his family never went without. His job wasn't glamorous, but it reflected his character, honest labor, steady commitment, and an unwillingness to take shortcuts. Colleagues remembered him as someone who never complained, who showed up no matter the weather, and who quietly carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Outside of work, James had a softer side. He enjoyed evenings with friends, sharing simple conversations over tea, and finding peace in small things, like fixing something around the house or helping a neighbor with a broken fence. To his community, he was more than just another face. He was someone dependable, someone you could call on in times of need. But, as is often the case in true crime stories, James's life wasn't without shadows. Beneath the steady exterior were challenges he rarely shared openly, financial struggles, the constant pressure of providing, and the kind of silent battles that weigh a person down over time. Friends later recalled moments where James seemed unusually quiet, as if carrying thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. Still, he pushed forward, never allowing those burdens to define him. His resilience became part of his identity, though it also masked vulnerabilities that made him more human, more relatable, and ultimately, more tragic. When people later learned of his murder, the shock wasn't just about the violence itself, it was about the man who had been taken away. A man who asked for little, gave so much, and lived in a way that left an imprint on everyone around him. To truly understand the magnitude of James Barrie's brutal end, we must first understand the man himself, the ordinary yet extraordinary life he lived, the relationships he built, and the quiet strength he carried. Because only then can we grasp the full weight of the tragedy that unfolded, and why his story continues to haunt those who remember him. Every crime has a beginning, a moment in time when the ordinary suddenly twists into something unthinkable. For James Barrie, that moment came on what seemed like an otherwise unremarkable day, one that began just like so many others before it. The morning of the murder carried no obvious signs of the tragedy about to unfold. James woke early, as he always did, preparing himself for another long day. He followed his routine with a quiet discipline, brewing his tea, reviewing small tasks that needed his attention, and exchanging brief words with those around him. To anyone watching, there was nothing unusual, nothing alarming. It was a day that should have passed without consequence. But somewhere between those routine hours, fate had already shifted. Unknown to James, danger was closing in. Whether it was a premeditated plan or a sudden act of violence born from rage, that day would end differently than anyone expected. Witnesses later recalled seeing James moving about, handling his errands, and going about life as if nothing was wrong. The cruel truth was that he had no idea his final hours were ticking away. As the day went on, small fragments of time began to piece together the story. A neighbor remembered spotting him walking back home, his expression calm, unaware that it would be one of the last times anyone would see him alive. Others recalled hearing unusual noises later that evening, sounds that would only make sense after the crime was discovered. The hours leading up to his death remained chilling because of their ordinariness. There was no warning, no desperate call for help, no sign that the walls of his familiar surroundings were about to turn into the setting of a brutal murder. It was this very normalcy that made the violence to come so shocking. By nightfall, the silence of James's home concealed the horror that had taken place inside. Behind closed doors, an act of savagery was carried out with merciless intent. The brutality of what James endured would later leave investigators shaken and his loved ones haunted by the thought of his final moments. That day, what began as just another chapter in James Barrie's ordinary life ended as the final, horrifying page. A man who had spent his years working, giving, and enduring quietly had been met with violence so cruel, it would forever mark his story in the annals of true crime. The day of the murder wasn't just about the act itself, it was about the betrayal of normalcy, the sudden collapse of safety, and the irreversible moment when James Barrie's life was stolen away. A day that began with routine ended in blood, leaving behind only questions, grief, and the beginning of an investigation that would soon uncover the darker truths behind his death. The true horror of James Barrie's murder did not reveal itself until the discovery of his body, a moment that would forever alter the lives of those who stumbled upon it, and one that would ignite a wave of fear and disbelief in the community. It began with silence. Hours passed without anyone hearing from James, which was unusual for a man as predictable and responsible as he was. He wasn't the type to vanish without explanation, and when messages went unanswered and calls rang endlessly, unease began to settle in. For his closest friends and family, the silence was the first warning sign that something was wrong. The discovery itself was as haunting as the crime. A neighbor, concerned after noticing that James's house remained dark and uncharacteristically quiet, decided to check in. What awaited behind that door was a scene of unimaginable brutality. As they entered, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating, a stillness that didn't belong in a lived-in home. Nothing seemed right. The orderliness James was known for was shattered. Furniture was overturned, objects scattered, and a sense of chaos filled the rooms. But the true horror lay just ahead. There, in the confines of his own home, James Barrie's lifeless body was found. The brutality was undeniable. He hadn't just been killed, he had been attacked with a level of violence that spoke of anger, rage, or a motive far darker than a simple act of crime. His injuries told investigators that this wasn't random. This was personal. The sheer savagery of the attack stunned even the most experienced officers. It wasn't just the loss of life, it was the manner of it, the evidence of a struggle, the clear signs that James had fought desperately to survive but had ultimately been overpowered. Blood patterns marked the walls, objects were broken, and every detail screamed of violence. For the neighbor who made the discovery, the images of that night would never fade. What began as an act of concern turned into the trauma of witnessing the aftermath of a brutal murder. The news spread quickly, first among neighbors, then across the wider community. Shock turned into fear, and fear into grief, as people realized that the man they had trusted, respected, and relied upon was gone in the most horrifying way possible. When police cordoned off the scene, the quiet street transformed into a spectacle of flashing lights and hushed conversations. Journalists would soon gather, rumors would begin to swirl, but inside the home, detectives were faced with the grim task of piecing together what had happened in James's final moments. Every broken item, every bloodstain, every fingerprint carried a fragment of truth. The discovery of James Barrie's body was more than just the uncovering of a crime, it was the opening of a mystery. A mystery that raised immediate questions: who could have done this? Why James? And what could drive someone to unleash such savagery on a man who had lived his life with quiet dignity? That night, the crime scene became both a place of horror and the first step toward justice. For James's family and community, it marked the moment their lives would never be the same again. The brutal discovery of James Barrie's body was only the beginning. What followed was a painstaking investigation, one that would test the skills of detectives, uncover hidden truths, and slowly pull back the layers of a crime shrouded in mystery. From the very first night, investigators knew this was no ordinary murder. The savagery of the attack suggested deep emotion, anger, resentment, or perhaps betrayal. This wasn't the work of a random intruder, it was personal. That belief set the tone for the entire investigation. The crime scene was their starting point. Detectives meticulously documented every detail: the overturned furniture, the broken objects, the blood spatter patterns across the walls. Each fragment of chaos told a piece of the story. The struggle inside the home revealed that James had fought back, desperate to survive. Forensic teams searched for fingerprints, DNA, and any trace of the killer left behind in the frenzy of violence. But evidence alone could not explain motive. To understand who would want James Berry dead, investigators turned to the people around him. They began interviewing family, friends, co-workers, and neighbors. Slowly, a picture of James's private life began to emerge, one that was more complex than his quiet public image had suggested. Suspect after suspect came into focus. Some were tied to James through financial disputes. Debts and unpaid money had created tensions that, under the right pressure, could boil over into violence. Others were connected through personal relationships, arguments, jealousy, and unresolved conflicts that hinted at darker emotions beneath the surface. One theory suggested that James might have been targeted over money. Rumors circulated that he had recently come into a small sum, possibly from savings or side work, and some believed greed could have been the motive. Another lead pointed toward strained relationships, people in James's inner circle who carried grudges, old wounds that had never healed. Each suspect was questioned, their alibis tested. Some broke down under pressure, others grew defensive. But as the hours turned into days, detectives began narrowing their focus. Among the names on their list, a few stood out, individuals whose timelines didn't add up, whose stories shifted under scrutiny, or whose history with James hinted at unresolved anger. Still, the investigation was far from simple. For every promising lead, there were dead ends. For every suspect who seemed guilty, there was another with an equally strong motive. Detectives had to be cautious, because rushing to judgment could mean letting the real killer slip away. The media played its part too, fueling speculation. Headlines questioned whether James's murder was tied to money, jealousy, or something far darker. In the court of public opinion, nearly everyone became a suspect. But inside the investigation room, detectives worked quietly and relentlessly, piecing together timelines, testing forensic evidence, and waiting for the one breakthrough that would crack the case wide open. They knew the answers were there, hidden in the lies, the grudges, and the secrets of those who surrounded James Berry. The search for truth had begun, and the walls were closing in on those who thought they had gotten away with murder. The investigation into James Berry's murder eventually led to a turning point, a moment when the evidence gathered by detectives was strong enough to bring someone into the courtroom. For weeks, the community had waited, desperate for answers, and now the trial promised to reveal the truth behind the brutality. The courtroom became the stage where every detail of James Berry's final hours would be laid bare. Families filled the benches, James's loved ones on one side, the accused supporters on the other. Between them stood the law, tasked with unraveling the story of a man's violent end. From the very first day, the prosecution set the tone. They painted James Berry as a hard-working, decent man whose life had been stolen in an act of rage and cruelty. They presented photographs of the crime scene, forensic reports, and the haunting testimony of those who discovered his body. Every piece of evidence was a reminder of the violence James endured, and every word spoken sought to prove that the accused was responsible. The defense, however, fought back fiercely. Their strategy was to cast doubt, on the evidence, on the motives, even on the timeline of events. They argued that the case was built on circumstantial details, that investigators had rushed to judgment, and that others could just as easily be responsible for James's death. They scrutinized witnesses, questioned the reliability of forensic tests, and tried to paint an alternative narrative, one where their client was innocent. Witnesses took the stand, their voices carrying the weight of memory. Some spoke of James's life, offering a glimpse into his character. Others shared details that seemed small but proved vital in reconstructing the hours before his murder. The most powerful testimonies, however, came from forensic experts. Blood spatter analysis, fingerprint matches, and DNA samples built a scientific chain that tied the accused directly to the crime scene. Yet, even with the evidence stacked against them, the defense found cracks to exploit. They reminded the jury of other possible suspects, of unresolved financial disputes, of the possibility that James's life was more complicated than it appeared. In true crime, nothing is ever simple, and this trial was no exception. As the days turned into weeks, tension inside the courtroom grew. Families sat in silence, clinging to each word, waiting for justice. The jury deliberated for hours, sifting through testimony, weighing the evidence, and considering the defense's pleas for reasonable doubt. Finally, the verdict was delivered. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as the words were read aloud. Guilty. The accused was found responsible for the brutal murder of James Berry. Relief washed over some, while others sat in disbelief. For James's family, the verdict was both a victory and a heartbreak. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law, but no sentence, no punishment, could ever bring him back. The judge delivered a stern sentence, acknowledging the cruelty of the crime and the life that had been lost. The accused would spend decades behind bars, condemned not only by the court but by the community that had once trusted them. Still, questions lingered. Was the full truth revealed? Were there deeper motives that never surfaced? Trials end with verdicts, but they don't always erase the shadows left behind. For those who loved James Berry, justice provided closure, but never peace. His absence remained, a silent reminder that even in victory, the cost of loss is immeasurable. The verdict may have closed the trial, but the story of James Berry did not end there. For his family, friends, and the community he left behind, the impact of his brutal murder stretched far beyond the walls of the courtroom. For his family, the loss was immeasurable. James was more than just a victim, he was a son, a brother, a friend. His absence left an empty chair at every gathering, a silence in every conversation, and a void that could never truly be filled. Birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days alike were marked by the shadow of his absence. His loved ones often described the pain not as something that fades, but as something they learn to live with, an ache that lingers, a wound that never fully heals. The community, too, was shaken to its core. James had been a man people trusted, someone who gave more than he took, and his murder forced neighbors to confront the unsettling reality that violence could strike even in the most ordinary lives. For weeks after his death, people in the neighborhood locked their doors a little earlier, looked over their shoulders a little more often, and wondered who they could really trust. Fear became a part of daily life, replacing the quiet sense of safety they had once taken for granted. But beyond the grief and fear, James's story also left a legacy. In the wake of his death, his name became a reminder of resilience, of community, and of the importance of remembering those who are lost to violence. Friends organized small memorials, gatherings where stories of James's kindness were shared, painting a picture of a man who lived simply but touched lives deeply. His memory became a thread that connected people, reminding them of the fragility of life and the importance of valuing one another while they still could. Law enforcement, too, carried lessons from the case. The brutality of James Berry's murder, the complexity of the investigation, and the eventual trial all became reference points for how cases of such violence should be handled. For young detectives, the Berry case served as both a warning and an example, a stark reminder that behind every file, every report, and every piece of evidence lies a human life, a story that deserves justice. Even years later, the echoes of James's life and death remained. His story was retold in conversations, in whispers of caution, and eventually in documentaries like this one. To some, it was a chilling tale of how quickly life can be stolen. To others, it was a call to cherish the people around them while they still have the chance. James Berry's murder was not just an isolated act of violence, it was a moment that rippled outward, touching everyone connected to him. Though justice was served in the courtroom, his true legacy lives on in the memories of those who knew him, in the lessons learned from his case, and in the enduring reminder that behind every crime, there is a life that mattered. And so, while the story of James Berry is remembered for its tragedy, it is equally remembered for the man himself, quiet, kind, and steadfast. A man whose life, though cut short, continues to remind us all of the profound impact one person can have, even in the face of unimaginable loss.